Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the absolute darkest chapters in human history, the transatlantic slave trade. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, over 12 million Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic. Now, we all know the sheer heartbreaking human tragedy of this era, but today, we're going to look at the cold mechanics behind it. We're examining this not just as a horrific moral failure, but as an intricately engineered multinational supply chain, a system specifically designed at every single stage to extract maximum profit right at the expense of human lives.
Okay, let's dive into this. We're going to trace the evolution of this system, from its ancient roots all the way through the colonial catalyst that turned it into an industry. We'll look at the horrors of the Middle Passage, the chilling business of financing human cargo, the tipping point of abolition, and finally, its chillingly modern financial legacy.
Part 1. A Global System. Slavery Before the Atlantic.
To really wrap our heads around the transatlantic trade, we have to recognize that buying and selling human beings was, sadly, woven into the economic fabric of the ancient world long before European ships ever dropped anchor in West Africa. Early slavery was actually a global phenomenon. We're talking ancient empires like Egypt, Rome, and China, stretching right through the Middle Ages with the Vikings and Frankish merchants. But here's what's crucial to understand. For centuries, this was largely based on warfare and religion, not race. For example, back in the 14th and 15th centuries, the Ottoman Empire and Barbary pirates ran massive trading networks based on a pretty simple logic. Christians didn't slave Christians, and Muslims didn't slave Muslims, but both sides readily enslaved people of other faiths. Plus, Arab middlemen had already been running huge trade networks, transporting millions of captives across the Sahara and the Indian Ocean for centuries.
Moving on to Part 2, the colonial catalyst, a problem of labor.
So what turned small-scale coastal raiding into a massive industrial enterprise? Well, the spark was 1492. When European powers started carving out empires in the Americas, they ran into an immediate, brutal problem: a massive labor shortage for their highly profitable sugar, tobacco, and cotton plantations. At first, they relied on the indigenous population, but that workforce was tragically decimated by newly introduced European diseases. Next, they tried bringing over European indentured servants, but honestly, they proved to be too few in number, way too costly, and completely ill-prepared for those harsh tropical environments. So the Portuguese found a chillingly efficient workaround. Rather than conduct their own dangerous slaving raids, they just tapped into the pre-existing infrastructure of African slave networks, trading European manufactured goods with coastal chieftains in exchange for war captives.
And that prudent logic gave birth to the infamous triangular trade. It worked like a perfectly oiled machine. Step 1, manufactured goods like firearms, cloth, and iron went from Europe down to Africa. Step 2, enslaved humans were transported across the Atlantic to the Americas. Step 3, the plantation produce grown by those enslaved people, things like sugar, rum, and cotton, was shipped right back to Europe to fund the start of the whole cycle all over again. English, Dutch, French, and Spanish merchants all muscled in on this, turning human lives into a seamless, highly lucrative part of a global commodity loop.
Part 3, the Middle Passage. Logistics and horror.
When we look at the physical realities of the second leg of that triangle, the cold logistics reveal their absolute darkest horrors. 15%, that is the grim mortality rate on these ships. Diseases like dysentery, smallpox, and scurvy spread like wildfire in these conditions. And the twisted part? Ship captains were actually financially incentivized to keep their human cargo alive to sell at market, but the brutal mathematics of severe overcrowding consistently worked against human survival.
Below the main deck, carpenters actually installed wooden platforms to create double tiers of sleeping surfaces. Just let that sink in. Every enslaved man, woman, and child was allocated a space barely larger than a coffin. They were shackled in these horrifying conditions in absolute darkness for 6 to 8 agonizing weeks. And yet, despite the chains, despite the heavily armed guards, the human spirit endured. Rebellions and uprisings were launched on hundreds of voyages throughout the trade's history.
Section 4. Financing human cargo, the business of bondage.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the broader economy managed to normalize such an abhorrent system. You see, it wasn't just rogue ship captains out there, it was entire respected financial institutions. A single slaving voyage was a massive financial risk. So to mitigate this, voyages out of major ports like Liverpool were divided into exactly 64 shares. This meant that up to 1,400 everyday citizens, we're talking manufacturers, lawyers, clergymen, and local politicians, could essentially buy a stake in a slave ship.
By spreading the risk across this enormous base of capital, the business of human bondage became deeply, invisibly embedded into the fabric of everyday society. If a voyage succeeded, everyone got a payout. If it failed, well, no single investor was ruined. By 1790, the port of Liverpool utterly dominated this trade, controlling a staggering 80% of Britain's Atlantic slaving activity. Why Liverpool? It was entirely structural. The city had invested heavily in the world's first commercial wet docks. Its merchants spent decades cultivating exclusive, named relationships with African chieftains to ensure a better supply. Plus, its proximity to the rapidly industrializing Midlands meant it had a constant, steady flow of the exact manufactured goods, like iron and textiles, that African traders wanted.
And this brilliantly illustrates just how deep the roots go. The modern financial web was quite literally built on the commodification of human beings. Underwriters at the famous coffee house that eventually became Lloyd's of London insured enslaved people simply as cargo, against loss. The Bank of England provided the massive credit lines needed to finance these vast operations, and merchants used bills of exchange to quickly turn over capital before a ship even completed its long, brutal circuit.
Part 5. Abolition and the Zong, the moral pivot. Eventually, the cold, calculated economics of this trade violently collided with a growing public conscience. The breaking point was the Zong massacre in 1781. The Liverpool slave ship Zong was critically overpacked. Following a terrible navigational error, their water supplies ran dangerously low. So the crew made a horrific financial calculation. If the enslaved people died of thirst on board, the ship's owners would have to absorb the financial loss. But if they were thrown overboard, legally jettisoned as cargo to save the rest of the ship, the owners could claim an £8,000 insurance policy. So the crew systematically murdered 132 enslaved people by throwing them into the sea. When the insurers inevitably refused to pay, the case actually went to court, and Lord Chief Justice Mansfield famously ruled that no murder charges would be brought against the crew. Why? He stated the case was exactly the same as if horses had been thrown overboard. That was the shocking, undeniable legal reality of the time. But the resulting public outrage from this massacre acted as a massive catalyst for the abolitionist movement.
Let's move to and see how this builds. The grassroots push following the Zong trial was truly incredible. Former slaves like Uluda Aquilano published best-selling autobiographies, giving the public first-hand testaments to the horrors. William Wilberforce introduced relentless bills in Parliament. Hundreds of thousands of everyday people joined boycotts of slave-grown sugar, a real hit to the wallet. Even economists like Adam Smith began arguing that free labor was actually more productive than enslaved labor, effectively attacking the trade's economic core. Finally, in 1807, the Slave Trade Act was passed, ending direct British involvement in the trade.
Which brings us to our final section, the lingering legacy, freedom and finance. It's absolutely vital to note that ending the slave trade on paper was vastly different from ending the institution of slavery globally. The end of slavery was scattered, uneven, and painfully prolonged. While Britain abolished its trade in 1807, the institution itself remained perfectly legal in its colonies until 1833. To even force the ban on the open seas, the Royal Navy had to establish the West Africa Squadron, seizing rogue ships for decades. The United States required a bloody, devastating civil war to end it in 1865. Brazil persisted all the way until 1888, and the Ottoman Empire didn't formally abolish it until 1908.
When abolition finally came to the British Empire in 1833, the aftermath presented a bitter, stark contrast. The formerly enslaved gained nominal freedom, sure, but they inherited a legacy of systemic poverty. They found themselves trapped in systems of debt and violence that essentially replicated the very conditions of slavery. Meanwhile, the British government awarded a staggering $20 million in compensation. But no, not to the victims. That money went to the slaveholders for the loss of their property. To put that into perspective, that was equivalent to roughly 40% of the entire annual national budget at the time.
So the crucial point is this. The British government had to take out a massive loan to fund that £20 million emancipation payout to the slaveholders. That immense debt, passed down through generations and generations of British taxpayers, was not fully paid off until the year 2015. Yeah, 2015.
This entire system was engineered and operated by seemingly ordinary people. Merchants, everyday investors, lawyers, and politicians. People who made the extraction of wealth from human lives entirely 100% legal. It literally built the foundation of modern finance and global commodity trading. Which leaves us with a haunting question to close out this explainer. How do modern societies reconcile with global economies built upon the legal extraction of wealth from human lives? We are absolutely still grappling with the legacy of that deeply engineered system today. Thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive, and as